You know, Kenny, I get my nose waxed on occasion. I get my ears waxed on occasion. I've never had my eyebrows waxed because then they look waxed, right? With respect to Eddie Alvarez and anybody else out there that actually waxed, right? But you can see this eyebrow. I took a huge chunk out of my eyebrow trying to thin them out this morning.
Yeah.
So I bring this up. I didn't intend to lead the show with this, but I've always said if I got like 6 or 8 weeks off, I would just completely shave them off or wax my eyebrows off and start over, because I know you can attest to this. You're not nearly as hairy a man as I am, but the maintenance of hair removal, especially for me as a guy who shaves his head all the time, like it's just brutal. Like I'll go to bed, I'll wake up and I have one eyebrow instead of two. I've always thought if I had like 10 weeks off, I would just wax them off completely. But people say they may never grow back. But if you notice a chunk out of my eyebrow, my daughter Tatum was like, can you borrow mommy's eyebrow pencil and like color that in? And I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that.
A little thin on that side. Sometimes we overdo it, man. But it looks like I kind of took one of the eyebrows and put it underneath my nose. I got this kind of crappy mustache that, you know, like the ultimate judge is kind of my daughter. Like I remember I showed up. She was probably like younger than 2 and I had a mustache on and she started crying. She was like, no, daddy, no. She just said, no. And now she's like, it's a beautiful mustache, daddy. So I, True's all in on the mustache. I probably won't have it too long, but here we are, man. A little bit of switching of the roles, I think.
Yeah, you're cleaned up. Although I will say, I mean, I don't know if you can look to your left for a minute. Does anybody see the locks flowing on Ken Flo's neck right now? I mean, you're trying to be Jason Anik fucking growing that shit out or what?
I got some length now, Ken.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. Some point.
I think you should let it go. What does Clark think about the long hair?
She likes the long hair. I'm also thinking like, I don't know how much longer I'm going to have this hair, Ken Flo, the hair guy, like that might be a distant memory. So at this point, I'm trying to let it go as long as I can. Losing some of I got the 5 head going on. So trying to keep it going, dude.
Well, you look pretty young. It's great to be back with you and everybody else. Monday, January 29th, 2024. It is episode 463 of the Anik Florian Podcast. And this weekend begins a stretch, Kenny, of 11 straight Saturdays with a UFC live event. As most of our viewership knows, since the UFC signed a television contract with ESPN in 2019. There have been some dark patches in December and January. Some of that, I think, has to do with college football inventory. But, we hit it hard with the pay-per-view 2 straight live events to begin January. And then the bye week, and fans are like, what am I going to do with myself? And now we have a stretch of 11 straight Saturdays with a UFC live event. April 20th is the next Saturday, the week after UFC 300. That's the first week from here until then that there won't be a UFC live event. So that is very exciting. And to that end, we got Paul Felder coming up here in about 15 minutes. But I want to get into some of the UFC 300 stuff if I could, because it's crazy as we sit here 10 weeks out. We do not have a main event for UFC 300. Now, the UFC has put out some things graphically to suggest that we are waiting on a main event. Whether it'll be for an undisputed UFC championship or not, I don't know. But if you go through the men's divisions, and it does tie in perhaps to Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler. Conor pushing out a tweet saying McGregor on 300 seals the deal. So maybe there's a window of hope that Conor and Chandler could headline. But Kenny, when you go through the men's divisions, right? Flyweight, doubtful Alexandre Pantoja. Bantamweight, UFC 299. Featherweight, UFC 298. It's not going to be Islam Makhachev, perhaps because of Ramadan. And we already have seen sort of the way the lightweight division has been laid out with Arman Tsarukyan and Charles Oliveira, Justin Gaethje, Max Holloway. So you got welterweight, Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad. Middleweight, depending on Dricus du Plessis' relative health. And then light heavyweight. And of course, the champion is Alex Pereira. And there are rumblings of a UFC pay-per-view in Rio de Janeiro on May 4th, and perhaps Alex Pereira would be held for that date. So we sit here now, Ken Flo, and it's not going to be the heavyweight division either, by the way, because John Jones is on the men. So we sit here now without a main event, and I'm just not sure that it's going to be an undisputed UFC championship. I think it might be Conor McGregor, Michael Chandler, Conor McGregor, Nate Diaz. I don't know, but I think by this time next week, we'll probably have an answer.
Well, here's the thing. Conor McGregor versus anybody is going to be the biggest fight you could put on UFC 300, right? I assume, him and Chandler, if there's going to be a non-title fight as a main event, it would be that one, right? That's probably the only choice. I think they might be leaning towards a DDP Adesanya fight. I think that's probably the one that I am most intrigued by. And as far as title fights, I think that's probably the biggest title fight that you can put on at this point. Now, I definitely want to see the Bilal Leon Edwards fight, but if they're trying to blow it out, just from a marketing standpoint, from what we've seen in the past, you got to think that Adesanya, being the big pay-per-view star that he has been for the organization, that fight against DDP would be the one to make. Now, it all depends on how healthy both of those individuals are. That would be my pick, but certainly, if the UFC is looking at it and Chandler and Conor are available, then that would be the one to do. The card's already stacked. It's almost like, do they need a main event at this point? I think they'd be just fine, but I think the UFC is looking to really stack that with one championship fight. And I hope it's Adesanya and DDP. That would be fantastic.
Now, you can be sure that Dana White and Hunter Campbell want to do right by Michael Chandler, who has been nothing if not a promotional soldier. But if you could put together a fight between Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz, the fan base would go batshit crazy. But I do hope that they do right by Chandler. And Michael Chandler has responded in kind. Conor McGregor has been out 2.5 years. If he's healthy, why are we waiting until UFC 302? Want to also talk about Dricus du Plessis in this equation because we had his manager, Danny Rubenstein, on our show last week, and he sort of suggested that while UFC 300 would be a massive payday, a big part of the financial gains for DDP are going to be rooted in successfully defending the title and making a defense or two as a champion. So expediting his first title defense or rushing into it on one leg potentially would not necessarily be the preferred option for them. I do want to read a quote here from Khamzat Chimaev because I do think in some part he factors into this equation, whether or not people think he is worthy of a middleweight championship opportunity or not. Here's the quote from Khamzat. All these guys have fought each other and only me is undefeated, undisputed. They promised me after the Utsman fight, I will for sure fight for the title. I won that fight, so I don't know what's going on. I heard Dana White say, I don't think Khamzat is next for the title. That's bullshit, man. If you promise me something, you have to answer it. In my mind, it should be me. So we'll see what happens, right? If I had to make a guess right now, I do think Dricus du Plessis is going to be fighting out of the red corner and the last fighter to walk at UFC 300. But it's really an interesting proposition. Now, I was at my twin brother's house today, and I couldn't find the genesis of these rumors, but he was talking about some situation whereby Leon Edwards would remain the welterweight champion, but the UFC would make that the 175-pound division and then maybe create a title at 165 pounds, and maybe you have Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler fight for that vacant title. Now, a lot of MMA fans hear that, and they probably want to throw up in their mouth. But the UFC can really do whatever they want. They created a BMF title, and a lot of people turn their nose up at a championship belt or a belt for the baddest on the planet, but that has worked out pretty well.
I mean, we talked about this years ago, John. I remember me talking about, and again, I don't work for the UFC anymore. I'm not trying to push this agenda or anything like that, but I talked about this a long time ago, how I thought that the sport in general should move away from, this welterweight weight class of 170 pounds, and that every division probably should be separated by 10 pounds, even have a 195-pound weight class, something like that. If the UFC can support it, which I think they can. But yeah, I think that it probably makes more sense to go from 185, 175, 165, 155. Now, the timing of this is interesting. I don't know if they're going to go this route. I think there's probably other things that they would need to establish. Perhaps I don't know enough about that, but I do think logistically and logically it makes more sense to have these divisions. Whether they do that or not, whether they do that to accommodate Chandler and Conor, I don't. I guess remains to be seen.
So I believe Conor McGregor's last win, correct me if I'm wrong, was Donald Cowboy Cerrone in January of 2020. Now, if anybody can fight for a UFC title 4+ years removed from their last mixed martial arts win, it would be Conor McGregor. But perhaps that is an option. I will say it seems as though the UFC women's featherweight division is no more. If they have come out and announced the death of that division, I have not heard it. But you are eliminating a women's division, so perhaps there is a window now to add another men's division. And I will say big picture. One thing Lorenzo Fertitta always wanted was to have these championship doubleheaders as sort of a fail-safe mechanism in case you lost a main event or a co-headliner, that you would always have a title fight on pay-per-view. We have had a few pay-per-views, UFC 291, BMF belt, right, but that have not been headlined by an undisputed UFC title fight. But those instances are few and far between. So I do think we are coming to a point, Kenny, instead of doing 12 pay-per-views a year, now doing 14, the timing might just be right to add another men's division.
Right. Well, also, and looking at the card, and I assume this is somewhat confirmed, right? There's 9 fights confirmed, I think, as of right now, UFC 300. So there is space, right? And there is space to maybe have, another title fight or two on the card. So